Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Vic, and you are watching an event called Real Lives, Real Hope, which is being hosted by St Andrew the Great Church in the city centre in Cambridge. And this is a series of interviews where we meet a different Christian each time, and they connect something of their life and their work with their Christian faith. And we're really delighted tonight to be joined by James Cary, who is a comedy writer. James, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Can you just tell us a little bit about how life has been for you in the last few weeks over lockdown? How have you found it?
This third lockdown, I was just thinking, just feels like it's never ending. I don't know. It felt like the first one was a bit exciting and weird. The second one felt like inevitable and we could just get through it and Christmas would come. This third one just feels really, really restrictive, which I guess is the point. But I don't know. It feels like we're never going back to normal, which I think we are eventually, but I think we all secretly suspect that it's not ending anytime soon.
What are you missing most from normal life?
I tell you what I'm excited about before I miss it. I'm excited that cricket is on Channel 4. So that's really exciting. I did miss going to cricket over the summer last year. That was all very sad. So I miss crowds. So that, fake audience noises are not something I'm a big fan of, even though I'm a sitcom writer and people always assume that the laughter they hear is all canned and fake. It really isn't. But yeah, so seeing empty stands but hearing a crowd of 30,000 people, that's always a bit weird. So I miss the reality of that.
Well, hopefully we'll get back to the buzz of all of that quite soon. I'm going to be talking to James tonight about this question, which I guess connects comedy and Christianity, which is Christianity absurd? And we'll have a chat about that. But then later on in the evening, you will have a chance to pose your own questions to James if you'd like. And the way to do that, if you're watching live, is either to post them on the Facebook or YouTube chat section, or you can go to pigeonhole.at/absurd. And you can enter questions there, but you can also vote on other people's questions. So if you want to head over there, see what other people have written as their questions and vote them up, then please do that. It would be really great to hear from you. That's only for people who are watching live. So if you're catching up with this a bit later, then I guess you better hope that the people watching tonight are asking the very questions that you want answers to. Okay, well, it's great to be able to consider this big question with James. But before we do that, let's just find out a little bit more about him. So James, you're a comedy writer. You write for TV and radio, and you've also written a couple of books, I think, and plays, and you do some podcasting as well. So quite a range of things. Can you just tell us a bit about how you got into comedy writing and why you love it?
I think I got into comedy writing because I love comedy rather than I love writing. So I think even writers who write a lot sort of hate writing. I guess there are two sorts of writer. There are the writers who love writing and the writers who love having written. So writing is sort of complete torture, but once they've done it, they feel happy about it. Although actually, when I'm actually writing and it's going well and I can hear the voices talking and I can hear the jokes and stuff, then that feels good. But it is a discipline, I suppose, as much as anything else. But I'm into comedy writing because I love comedy, and I've always liked, and it sounds a bit silly, but I've always really liked laughing, which I'm surprised more people aren't into comedy as a result of that. But when I was a kid growing up, I just only really wanted to watch comedy or cricket, as I've mentioned earlier. So if it wasn't either of those two things, I didn't really see the point. So yeah, I just sort of then kind of mimicked the comedy that I was watching as a kid, and then went to university.
What did you love watching as a kid?
Oh, stuff like, I mean, I'm 45, so I can still remember the Two Ronnies and things like that, and sitcoms like Porridge and MASH and Cheers, and I mean, particularly with sitcoms, a lot of American comedy. And to me, American just sounds like the natural language of situation comedy. So Friends, for example, is obviously the absolutely titanic great show. It's not my favorite show, but it is a really good show. So yeah, and because I've always wanted to understand how it works, therefore I've sort of ended up trying to write comedy therefore I ended up writing. So for me, writing comedy was a means to an end of understanding comedy, and sort of putting it up on, opening the bonnet and just sort of having a rummage around inside. So yeah, so I wrote sketches when I was at university. You're in Cambridge. I failed to get into Cambridge, not only once but twice. I don't know how many guests you've had that have failed to get in, and I failed to get into Corpus Christi the first time and Trinity the second time. I thought, if I'm going to go to Cambridge, I'll go to the best college with 15 former prime ministers and Sir Isaac Newton and all that kind of stuff. And funnily enough, I didn't get in. So I went, like many people who failed to get into Cambridge, I went to Durham and spent 3 very happy years there, mostly writing comedy and directing it and having fun doing that, and studying theology in my spare time for my degree. So yeah. So and then I when I tried to get other jobs and went to interviews for them, and they didn't really believe that I wanted to do the jobs. And so like everybody at Durham, I applied probably for a job at Ernst & Young or Procter & Gamble. And when I went for the interview, they just sort of didn't really think that I wanted to work for them. And the reality was I didn't, because I just wanted to write comedy. But this is kind of 1997, 98. And people just didn't know anyone who wrote comedy. That writing wasn't a thing. I'm a son of a dairy farmer. Literally my parents and grandparents and great grandparents, they're all dairy farmers. So I just sort of moved to London and tried to become a comedy writer, and eventually, I guess fake it till you make it. But I'd had quite a few years practicing at school and university, so by the time I got an opportunity, I was good enough just to kind of sneak in and start to build a career from there.
That is wonderful. So yeah, that's great.
Not exactly an inspiring story, but a mixture of lack of alternatives plus a bit of aptitude, I guess.
And of all the things, you've worked on loads of different things, haven't you?
I have.
What have been some of your highlights in terms of the stuff you've worked on?
I guess the best known thing I've done is the first 2 series of Miranda. I worked on that and had a lot of fun doing that. It was nice to do a show which lots of people really like. Obviously, the show makes other people extremely angry. And having said that, when it started, there was no great thought that it was going to be popular. And I remember the reviews on after the first show were pretty negative, actually, and it seems sort of weirdly inevitable that it was going to be this massive hit. But anyway, there's that. The show that I then did after that, which I'm really proud of, is a show called Bluestone 42, and I've got a DVD up there, which is about bomb disposal in Afghanistan, and we might dig into that a bit later. But that's about soldiers and that sort of thing, and there's some episodes of that I'm really proud of. And then there's another show there which you can see called Think the Unthinkable. That was my first show I did as a radio show about management consultants in the days when we used to think management consultants were funny. And the idea, when somebody said pushing the envelope, you would laugh at them because it's a ridiculous thing to say. And now it isn't somehow. The consultants have won. So that was my first show, which I wrote on my own, and then I sort of teamed up with other people at various other points in my career. So I did another show for Radio 4 called Hut 33 about about code breaking in World War II. And I've written episodes of other people's shows. I wrote an episode of My Family and some episodes of My Hero. And so mainly half-hour comedy is what's been paying the mortgage, really, and paying the rent for the last 15, 20 years.
And mainly sitcom, right?
Yeah, that's right. Half-hour narrative comedy, usually in front of an audience. The Afghanistan show couldn't be filmed in front of an audience because obviously it kind of had to be filmed. I was going to say on location. We didn't film it in Afghanistan. We filmed it in South Africa, which is a much nicer place with many more vineyards than Afghanistan has, as you could probably imagine. Yeah, we had a great time filming there.
And what is it then about the sitcom format that you like so much?
I think obviously there's a kind of a cartoonishness to it, but what I like about it, firstly, is I think it's an intrinsically moral form of comedy, and in a sitcom, everything that you do and say, everything that the characters do and say matters and has consequences. And although time is always compressed, and most episodes of sitcoms tend to take place within 12 to 72 hours, There's always like a very kind of short time span to them. So I just like the fact that they're almost like little morality tales, little Aesop's fables, and they are profoundly Judeo-Christian, whether people like it or not. And so if somebody tells a lie early on in the episode, that lie is going to be exposed, and there will be consequences to that lie, and then they'll have to tell a bigger one to cover up that lie, and then they'll tell a bigger one to cover up those lies, and then the truth will out. And so, and in a way, this is kind of true to life, because our sins are the things we do wrong, have consequences, and actually trying to do the right thing also is a lot harder than it looks. And so our characters are always struggling to overcome obstacles in order to achieve an end, and sometimes it's a good one, sometimes it's a bad one. So there's an infinite sort of complexity to that, which from an artistic point of view I really enjoy. Every episode's almost like a puzzle that needs to be solved, and then almost every individual joke is another little puzzle within a puzzle that needs to be solved. And then when the audience laugh, that means you've solved the puzzle. That means that one, you got that one right. And then you sort of move on to the next one, and hopefully you get more right than you get wrong.
And it's really interesting, because you're starting to do that lift the bonnet stuff for us in terms of how comedy works. And I know you've written in this book, The Sacred Art of Joking, about comedy and about like what it is, why people laugh at it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, kind of explore that idea a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, in the book I sort of do a little bit of explaining the basic theory, but also the theory that I'm not sure there is a theory. And it would be great if there was some kind of grand unified theory of comedy, but if there were, then every comedy would be really funny, and every joke would work, because we'd know how it works in the same way that we understand, Newtonian physics or whatever. It's like, well, you just do the following and it works. So there is something mercurial about it. It's an art, not a science. It's a dark art, in fact, I would always say. I think so. I've read books, and I've read books about books written by often Danish or German philosophers, and theologians, and these are easily the least funny books in the world. And writing about comedy is very, very rarely funny. And there's the old expression about dissecting a frog, telling a joke and explaining a joke and dissecting a frog. The frog dies, and I don't quite know how the rest of it goes. But there is something funny, though, about I think juxtaposition, putting stuff next to each other and making things say that this is like that. So in many ways, a lot of art is essentially connecting things that don't appear to be connected, and then you place them next to each other. Oh, and there is a connection. But also in comedy, often those connections are absurd, or they're satirical, where you say this person is like that. This politician is like a fox. They are cunning and they are this or that. So you're kind of being satirical about it, or you say, don't they look ridiculous? They look like a horse or whatever, which is obviously not a kind thing to do. But so you're kind of making connections and you're making disconnections. But there are kind of, but the moment you think you've explained every joke, someone will then say, yes, but what about knock jokes? And you go, oh, that doesn't really fit my theory. So yeah, I don't have a grand unified theory of comedy, but you sort of know when you're getting close to it, and you sort of know what joke is going to work and what isn't. We know more about jokes than we think we do, because when you hear a kid tell a joke, you know why it's gone wrong. And it's often funny because it has gone wrong, but the joke has actually gone wrong. So, or they hear a joke and they like the effect, so they kind of repeat the joke, but they sort of change some of the words.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work, but it's delightful, isn't it?
Yeah. My 3-year-old niece has been trying to learn jokes at the moment, but the best one she's come up with is a bollard walked into a bar and said, "Why the big pause?" Great.
Yeah. And you just think, yeah, we all know why that sounds like a joke, but isn't.
Yeah. Give her a few years, she'll be there.
Absolutely.
So given that you've done quite a lot of thinking about comedy, but you're also a Christian, it seems like you're well placed to help us to try to answer this question: is Christianity absurd? People watching, remember, you can ask questions and we'll put them to James at the end, because I'm sure we won't cover everything in the chat we're going to have now. So let's think about this. I think to many people, Christianity does seem really absurd in that it seems illogical and unreasonable and therefore ridiculous. And I guess to start with, a lot of people would find it absurd to think that people in 21st century Britain or anywhere around the world in this kind of scientific age would kind of base their lives on something like the Bible, that this book they think is the word of God, kind of tells them how to believe and what to be and how to behave. Isn't that absurd in itself?
I mean, I guess it seems so from the outside, but in the grand scheme of things, throughout the world and throughout the sum total of human history, to not believe in anything would be the absurd position. So almost everybody who has ever lived would look at atheism and think, oh, how absurd. How completely dehumanizing it is, or whatever it is. They would find it very puzzling. So in one way, I would think that the outlier is unbelief, historically speaking and globally speaking. But obviously, it doesn't seem that way if you are an extremely well-educated person living in a very nice city like Cambridge, surrounded by academia. So I guess there's that. The other thing is, I think the alternative views are also absurd. So I think we can. So again, from the outside, Christianity particularly appears to be a closed system that's closed in on itself. And I'm not a great philosopher of science, and I'm sure other guests have already done a better job than me. But I look at the alternatives, and so it's really interesting. Bill Bryson's Brief History of Nearly Everything is a fantastic book explaining science. But the bit where he explains how life began and the sheer number of coincidences required to create a single amino acid or protein or something, and therefore the single number of, and that is what gives us life, then you look at that and just think, well, that's absurd. I mean, it's ridiculous. So there's absurdity at the heart of these two competing systems. But I don't find either one either compellingly more or less absurd than the other. And absurdity is probably an overrated way to measure something anyway, because lots of things appear absurd at first and on closer inspection appear entirely reasonable, and lots of things look reasonable but are actually not true. Yeah, it kind of scooting around all over the place here, but yeah, I think absurdity is probably not a good way to judge something. But what is interesting about absurdity is it does make you pay attention, and it does make you lean in. It can be alienating, of course, but I think that's what I find most compelling about Jesus is he tells stories that are often quite absurd. They sort of, so if you look at the parables and the things that he says, they sort of start in odd places and they finish in odd places. So that the Bible and lots of classical stories have a very classical structure of, someone has a quest, someone, there are these kind of beginning, middle, and end thing, and opposition, and there are lots of stuff. But Jesus's parables are very strange, and they often sort of finish in midair. They don't get resolved. Even parables that people think they know, like the parable of the prodigal son, is actually the older brother is standing outside sulking, and the father begs for the older brother to come in and celebrate because the prodigal son has returned, and it ends. So what happens? There's like a cliffhanger there. And I think Jesus is really good at getting us just to lean in and go, what's going on? And so I guess the miracles, I really thought a lot about miracles recently. The miracles of Jesus obviously are absurd in the sense of, well, you just can't do that. People can't walk on water. That's absurd. But when he does these things, he's doing it to say, isn't this interesting? What does this mean? And so there's like a meaning to the absurdity, which if you scratch below the surface, you discover that all of these things are connected to other stuff and other bits of the Bible. So I think absurdity is a very intriguing, compelling thing, even though obviously it can look foolish. But I guess Shakespeare's Motley Fool is a very powerful character and a very powerful idea, and I think you find that throughout the Bible.
And so do you think are you saying Jesus then, as presented in the Bible, deliberately uses absurdity or humor, other kinds of humor, to kind of pull people in?
Yeah, and also not quite turn people away, but to kind of almost get rid of time wasters. It's really interesting. The more you read the New Testament and the more you read the gospel accounts, the more surprising it is. Jesus never really, loads of people just walk away from Jesus, and he never runs after them to say, no, 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 you misunderstood, please come back, please come back. People kind of go up to him, they kind of sort of bounce off, or they come to him with an agenda. Hey, Jesus, can you settle this argument between me and my brother? And then Jesus tells them a story, and you can sort of just see them both quite disappointed because both of them were hoping to be vindicated. So I think it is intentionally intriguing and cryptic, so that when and in a way this kind of chimes in with really rewarding box sets. I watched all 8 series of Game of Thrones, and we can talk about whether that's appropriate behavior for a Christian or not, if you like. There is too much gratuitous nudity. Okay, that's fine. But by the end, you've just got so many plots and subplots running. It's so incredibly complex that every single thing that everyone is doing has a meaning to it, and it's paying off this story, setting up this thing, doing this, so that when these big events happen, they have unbelievably complex significance, and they're extremely satisfying. So it would be odd if the Bible didn't have that. But if you walk in on episode 7 of series 5, you're going to find it rather confusing. And therefore the Bible, and Jesus rightly understood, is going to take some time to get you up to speed. So I think what we're presented with is a story that is interesting when we get into it, but also the more we learn about the story, the more we want to look back, we want to look forward. What does this mean? How is that connected? Even though the moments in themselves are actually comprehensible, there's nothing terribly difficult to understand about who Jesus is talking to or what roughly he's on about. I can't remember the question now. I'm terribly sorry. But whether it's on, but I think Jesus does deliberately do these things to make people lean in. But sometimes he's not. Sometimes he's completely crystal clear, and he's incredibly rude to people, mostly the elites, mostly people around the temple courts, who don't like him, don't like what he stands for, doesn't like the donkey he rode in on. And so he says really awful things about them, to their faces, calling them murderers, whitewashed tombs, serpents, and they didn't like it. I mean, then they killed him. So it's like, tough crowd. So I think so. Jesus is often clear, repent and be baptized. I mean, couldn't really be any clearer than that. But then there's a story about, well, there was a man who went on a journey and then he did this, and then it's like, oh, what does that mean? Well, could mean a few things.
Okay, so some of the things that people might think of as absurd in the Bible, when you look at them more closely, they fit into this big narrative, like you're saying. But also something Jesus himself deliberately uses strange strategies, including almost saying things that will push people away or draw people in order to get them to understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit like, the internet does that all the time, doesn't it? It's sort of clickbait. It's like, here are 2 things that are put together, and you're really going to want to know more about this, because on the surface, this doesn't make any sense. And so you kind of lean in. If you're then disappointed, it's just like you feel cheated. But actually, if there's then another thing that, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting again. Oh, I wonder what else this person's written. Oh, I'll look at that and look at that. And it sort of starts to go in, and then you kind of, you get the book, or you find their YouTube channel, or that then puts you onto a whole different line that you hadn't really thought about. So this is all kind of a normal way of communicating. But the moment we sort of see these things happen in the Bible, or see Jesus using these tactics, we suddenly just think, what on earth is he doing? And you go, well, this is just how people talk. But I guess that's one of my big things about what I talk about in the book, is how we kind of have this idea of what a religious text should sound like, and how, religious people spake, they don't speak, they spake unto people, and all that kind of stuff. And they were people, and they spoke. And when Moses saw a burning bush, he thought, that's weird, because it is weird. When the disciples saw Jesus ascending into heaven, they were probably pretty puzzled by that, because even Jesus hadn't done that before. That was a new one. They'd seen him walk on water and feed 5,000 people, floating and then disappearing off into the sky. What are you supposed to make of that? So I think I'm always interested in those human reactions to those things, and quite often you do still get them in the Bible, but because we tend to read them out in a slightly pompous Bible voice, all of these things tend to go away. But we don't do that with Shakespeare. So it seems odd to me that we would then do them with the Bible, but I guess that's part of another discussion.
Yeah. So, but I guess what could be useful from that is just to think, if we do want to find out more about this, if we think actually we have dismissed Christianity as pretty absurd, but maybe it's worth investigating more, just read the Bible as a normal text and see what you make of it. Is that what you?
I think so. Yeah, just read a gospel, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, whatever, and then just sort of, does it make sense, and which bits are puzzling? Because if they're puzzling, they're probably meant to be puzzling, and you should probably have a think about them. And the more that you get familiar with the source material, the more you'll realize the significance. When Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at a well, everybody at the time is just thinking, oh, he's at a well. This is where our ancestors kept meeting their wives, at wells. This is where Jacob made actually a pretty poor choice at a well, but his, that's kind of, these things all have significance, which is what you would do if you were writing a play or a movie. Is like you have key characters doing key things in key places that have been set up earlier as being significant. But if we only ever preach, and this is sort of as much a comment to churches and how we do it as to those who are investigating, because we tend to preach little chunks and explain them. We tend to not then connect them with the bit before and the bit after, but the bit much before and the bit much after. But yeah, it bears very close scrutiny, and it is endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because I know I've heard you speak before about particularly the Easter story. So I guess this is central to the Christian faith, the story that Jesus, after his time on earth, was then in his last few days betrayed, condemned to be crucified, and then died, and then was the Christian claim is resurrected. James, I've heard you talk before about the humour in that. It doesn't sound like a very funny story.
No, no, it doesn't. It doesn't really, does it? I mean, it is comic. I mean, there's tons of comedy going on. I was just sort of thinking about that again this morning for something coming up this Easter, and just how much irony there is going on about how, I mean, it's the very idea that it's like God came to earth and became a man. Oh, great. How did that go? We killed him. What? What? That sounds like a bad idea. Yeah, I know. How did that go? Well, not that well, actually. That's a really interesting thing for me. I've got a book coming out in June where I talk about how it's interesting that when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead in John's gospel, that's one of the more famous miracles. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and the people who were there go back to the temple and they say, what did he do? He says, oh, he just raised Lazarus from the dead. Wow, this guy has power over life and death. Let's kill him. And you think, no, I don't think that's going to work. See how you get on. But weirdly, when Jesus predicts his own death to his disciples, they've been with him all the time. I mean, this guy's bulletproof. Jesus can walk on water. He can feed 5,000 people. And Jesus says, I'm going to be arrested and killed. And they go, well, what does that mean? And it's like, because to them, they're just thinking, well, this is idiotic. Of course he can't be arrested and killed. He's got a host of 1,000 angels at his command. He can do whatever he likes. He could vaporize people. He could, and then when he is crucified, they're astonished. It's like, he never mentioned this. When did he, and so they couldn't believe it. And when he was raised from the dead, they were just like, they genuinely didn't expect that. So it's full of, the disciples. One of the great things that makes the Gospels particularly so believable and so true and so authentic is that disciples are idiots. They really come out of it so badly. And if you were fabricating a gospel to put a positive gloss on things, you would never make yourself look quite so dumb, or, you know, argue over who's the greatest, you know, which of us gets to sit next to you in heaven. It's just like, don't leave that in. You're going to. So, you know, and so as people are mocking Jesus on the cross, going back to how the cross is funny, again, it's dark comedy, but they're saying, you know, he saved others, but he can't save himself. It's like, no, he could save himself, but he's choosing not to. And they hammer a sign above him saying, this is the King of the Jews. And they're joking. And the joke is, it's not a joke. So you just kind of get these things. And the first person to recognize that there's clearly, you know, this is clearly a righteous man is a centurion of all people. Whereas the people who understood the scriptures and knew them by heart didn't, just couldn't see it, just couldn't get it. So all of these kind of things, which if you were doing a movie of this sort of thing, it would be hard to play them any way other than comically, because we have information that the people in the show don't have, and the irony is overwhelming. But again, of course, there's so much imagery attached to it, and it is an awful thing that on Good Friday humanity killed Christ. I mean, that's the worst thing we've ever done, and yet, amazingly, ironically, God uses that in order to bring about the salvation of mankind. So yeah, it's irony all over the place. But yeah, it's not, I wouldn't open with it at the Comedy Store, you know. It's not that kind of funny. It is funny, ha ha, but it's not, you know, it's not A-grade stand-up material in a secular comedy club. But I don't know, you know, some people can make that funny.
Yeah. But I guess that bigger story that you're talking about, the claim that Jesus came to not save himself so that he could save everybody else, like in some ways that is an absurdity, isn't it, that God would choose to do that?
Yeah, and other religions that are widely available and are globally very successful would exclude Christianity purely on that basis. The idea that God would even become a man is a joke. So, you know, Islam would just discount Christianity on that basis alone. You know, God became man. No, he didn't. Well, he did. He did the following miracles. He can't have done them because he couldn't be God, because that's not how God works. It's just self-evidently funny to them that we would say that. I mean, to them, it's also not funny because it's unbelievably blasphemous, but they just must think we're idiots. But yeah, so that is interesting how all of these absurdities are there, because to the outsider, it is absurd that God would become a person, because God is so other. But yeah, so I've forgotten the question now. I can't remember how we got here.
You've answered it, which is
okay, great. Staggered around until I eventually hit upon something that sounded like an answer. That's great.
Maybe just to hear from you personally, before maybe one more question to finish off. So if Christianity from the outside does look so absurd, why do you believe in it?
Good question. I didn't used to. I was raised in a Christianish home, and I was taken to church a bit. And I do remember when I was about 11 or 12, just thinking, this Christianity is actually true, isn't it? Independently of whether I believe it or not. And I could live my life not believing it, or I could just obviously face up to what is obviously true. And if it isn't true, I guess that will become obvious as I get older. And, you know, and in my teens, I kind of looked around and just thought, is this actually true? And then I read a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which turned out to be the Da Vinci Code, the fictionalized version of it. And I remember just thinking, if this whole Christianity thing is some kind of elaborate hoax, then I guess this will come up if I study theology at university. And do you know what? It didn't. And I even did a third-year course on the Dead Sea Scrolls, because I'd heard also that the Dead Sea Scrolls are part of this massive cover-up, and that there was actually 3 Christs, and you know, and actually discovered that the Dead Sea sect were sort of proper old weirdos, and they were a bit like Branch Davidians or something. You know what I mean? It's that kind of, like, they were almost like a cult. outside. That's why they were outside in the Dead Sea area. And so it just makes complete sense of everything. And I keep looking at the alternatives and thinking, even though in some ways my life would be a lot easier if I weren't a Christian, certainly my secular work would be, because becoming a Christian is now quite, there's a book out called about being the bad guys. Christianity is now not just possibly not true, but is actually probably considered to be a social evil, because it makes people believe wrong things that other people consider to be hate speech. So there are plenty of reasons to pack it in, but it's as I say, that the Bible is kind of supernaturally true in a way that once you get into it, it's it's like cutting into part of God's creation, where you get the further and further and deeper and you get, the more beautiful it becomes, like a fractal mathematical equation, or like a cell. You just sort of the more you look, the more beautiful it becomes. So I think all of those things together, there's no one piece of evidence or one piece of knockdown, I'm a Christian because of this or that. It's kind of everything. But I think for me, it is just how compelling the Bible is, and how Jesus is the center of that story in a way that I don't believe could be fabricated. And I think the alternatives are even more absurd than how Christianity appears.
And so that might lead on to the final question quite well. So at the end of this book, you kind of turn things around and you take us to a part of the Bible, which says that in fact God is laughing at us, as if maybe we're absurd. Can you explain a bit about what you mean by that?
Yes, I suppose so. It's in one of the Psalms, isn't it? How God laughs at those who kind of plot and rage against him, because if he is the creator. I mean, I often refer it to our rebellion against God is so absurd. It's almost like your goldfish declaring war on you. It's like, okay, let's see how that goes. There's no way we can do it really, because we haven't really understood who God is if we think we can rebel against him. But so yeah, I think in a way that what the Bible again does extremely well is it shows that our best attempts to escape God just end up punching ourselves in the face and shooting ourselves in the foot and inflicting all kinds of damage on ourselves. And obviously that has very sad and tragic consequences. And we, look at just 20th century history alone would show you what secularist regimes are prepared to do in order to pursue their own version of secular utopia, which is what is at the heart of it. And so, yeah, we are absurd. I think the Gospels do a really good account of showing what being a Christian is like. It is realizing your own absurdity, and all of our pretensions and self-delusions really do melt away next to Jesus, and yet we still cling on to them, and yet he forgives us for them anyway, which is just the most wonderful truth for me.
Well, James, thank you so much. We have now got loads of questions from other people, so we'll have a go at asking as many of them as we can. Feel free to keep on voting for them, and also adding your own. Okay, so let's start with this one for some light relief. Do catchphrases on Miranda?
No, sorry. Some of them are based on real people that Miranda knows, especially the what I call, I think is genuinely a relative of hers, actually says that quite a lot. So there was one catchphrase which never caught on, which I wanted to, which was again based on a real thing, which is the so and so are we? It's the are we thing, which I always just thought that could become a real thing. Doing a live stream, are we? You could just use it for anything, and it just seems to be funny. But that one didn't catch on, and that is actually the nature of catchphrases, is you just do not know what's going to stick. And actually, I did write a catchphrase in my Bluestone 42 show. It only appears in one episode of series 1, but people loved it so much, and I can't say it unfortunately because it's got a really big sweary word in it. But it then became a bit of a feature of series 2 and 3, but it was based on what they do actually say in the army. But yeah, so catchphrases are very odd things. The Victor Meldrew catchphrase, I don't believe it. The guy who wrote it, I've suddenly forgotten, David Renwick, he didn't realize that he'd actually had Victor Meldrew say that as often as he had, until somebody pointed out that it was a catchphrase, and I think he then kind of threw it in now and then. If anything, though, writers are so obtuse, they sometimes stop writing something because somebody else has noticed that they keep putting it in. And even though people like it, they go, no, I'm not going to write it. We're a funny lot.
Yeah. That's good. Brill. Okay, let's go for oh, they all keep changing places. Hang on, I'm trying to keep up here.
What's the meanest, nastiest question that is essentially the subtext is, who on earth does this guy think he is? I'm happy with any of those kind of questions.
They're actually quite nice.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Not like Facebook then, is it?
It's very civilized on Pigeonhole, I think.
Okay.
So there's a personal one for you, James. You said that your life and especially work would be a lot easier if you weren't a Christian. So how does being a Christian make a difference to your work?
Yeah, so in some ways it would be easier, but just because I would be spared from having to make one or two decisions that I don't want to make. I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be. There are things you can and can't do that you discover that you don't want to do. There are one or two offers of work on one or two TV shows in the past where I've just thought, I don't like that show. I don't want to be part of that. I don't like the tone of it. It feels like a world I don't want to be part of. But I guess, I don't have a monopoly on morality. So I guess everybody has draws their own lines in different ways. But yeah, so yeah, and you do just find yourself being a Christian in mainstream secular media is pretty weird, and there really aren't many people, especially within comedy. So you do find yourself being the odd one out quite a lot, and I sort of hold my tongue quite a lot. But then I, say things occasionally. Obviously, people have realised on this live stream that I don't have a problem expressing myself in strange and countercultural ways. But yeah, that kind of gets you down after a while, that you do think, am I the only one? And sometimes the answer is, yeah, you are. But that's okay.
And so maybe a question that might go on from that. How do you see comedy being able to make Christianity more accessible? Do you think that could happen?
It's a tricky one, that, because I think there's a real problem that the way comedy works and the way society has gone have kind of collided to make this extremely tricky in the mainstream comedy space, at least. So if somebody is a Christian in a regular sitcom, them being a Christian will be the most important thing that will define them as a character. I mean, in a way, we shouldn't be surprised at that, because I, as a Christian, am defined more by that than I am basically by anything else. I know I'm white. I know I'm male. I know I'm, the son of a dairy farmer. I know I live in Somerset. But actually, I would say my faith defines me. I'm an image bearer of God. That all is primary, as well as being a husband and a father and everything else. But sitcoms tend to kind of, again, I've mentioned that they're a bit cartoonish. So this character is probably going to be predominantly this, but also a bit that. If somebody's Christian, then they're going to be Christian, and therefore they're not going to be normal. And that will irritate Christians, because Christians want to be seen to be normal. Whereas actually we're not. And I don't think we should try to be. One of our problems is we try too hard to be normal. But that's a discussion for another time. But I guess it chimes in with the absurdity thing as well, isn't it? We need to be prepared to be absurd. So, might as well get used to it. So the moment you have a Christian character, they're then kind of representing all Christians in the UK. And of course, all Christians in the UK do not see eye to eye on virtually anything. So suddenly it becomes, some people find it troublesome. Some people just think you're being rude. Some people think, well, you must be, what was the thing? The Sacred Art of Joking book up there, I think it was reviewed in the Daily Express online, And then a load of people commented that it just wasn't appropriate to be making jokes about Christianity, which I don't do in the book, but they hadn't read it and they didn't care. So people kind of react to the idea of something before they've actually even engaged with it. So it's a real old hornet's nest, really. But it's something I'm really interested in doing. And I do actually have an idea that is kind of extremely Christian as a sitcom idea. Maybe I might make it myself for audio. So, you know, watch this space. Follow me on Twitter, and you'll find out more about that. But the problem is, because of the simplification that's required within comedy, suddenly you're having people make binary choices. And we all know that life is much more complicated than that. Hence, the book of Proverbs has loads of proverbs which say X and not X. And we live in a world where we know both X and not X are true. And actually fiction helps you get there and explores that. But Christians tend to be rather literal, which is a bit of a sad thing, but it's true. And so the moment they hear Christians saying things they don't like or agree with, then the writer is obviously a terrible person and should be deeply ashamed of themselves. So you can understand why it's not particularly tempting to go into that area. But I would happily do so if I had the right idea. But Christianity is now so culturally weird that if you had a Christian-based idea, a TV commissioner would just sort of wouldn't really want to commission it because they just don't think anyone's interested. And there is some truth in that. You know, Rev was quite a long time ago now. Vicar of Dibley was even longer. Getting one of those shows commissioned now, I think, would be quite hard. But there are other ways. We don't have to just represent Christian faith. There are other imaginative ways of storytelling that would actually have the same effect. So, you know, who knows?
Great. It's exciting, isn't it, to think what might happen? Someone here wants to know, do you think God is funnier than we give him credit for?
Yeah. Top 10 comedy moments in the Bible. I mean, which is a sub question, which I think is a really good one. Yeah, I think we take ourselves far too seriously. And I think God is joking and Jesus is joking way more often than we think he is. Now, I don't want to be, you know, I'm a hammer, therefore everything's a nail. Oh yeah, Jesus was a stand-up comedian. No, he wasn't. But he was sometimes funny. And the idea that he could not be funny or was never funny makes him less human and makes him that's just not how people communicate. And actually the only people who had a proper sense of humor failure all the time were the religious people, and they're the ones that killed him. So we don't really want to be in that team. So I think once you're open to the possibility of Jesus joking, then actually other things do start to make a bit more sense. There's a book called the Humour of Christ, which went out of print 30-40 years ago. It's quite hard to get a hold of now. And it's the best thing about it is it's written by a guy called Elton Trueblood. I mean, what could be a better name than that? Brilliant. And he says quite rightly, and I don't agree with all his assessments always, but he says if you assume that Jesus is never joking, there are some things that he says that just aren't going to make any sense. So you know, Jesus kind of got it. He kind of got the joke, and he messes with people, and he does that on purpose. But there are loads of funny things in the Bible, and my next book is actually specifically about quite a lot of those. But yeah, I mean, there's, you know, talking donkeys in Numbers, for example. I've written a whole play partly based on that. But yeah, also the actual miracles themselves are funny, because they're just. Say again?
Give us an example of that.
Well, I mean, so Jesus walking on water, you know, if you can imagine being there, it would be creepy and weird, but it would also be funny. Or Jesus, the ascension is, as I said before, is kind of funny. But what happens in movies when something really weird happens, like an alien spacecraft lands, what normally happens is a security guard looks at the thing that they're drinking and just thinks, oh, I better give up drinking. There are loads of things like that in the Bible, which any normal person would assume that they were seeing things. And therefore, the reaction to that, if you were dramatizing it, would be kind of comic. I mean, the Transfiguration, I think, is really funny. So Jesus goes up a mountain, and there he's with Elijah and Moses, and Peter, James, and John are with Jesus, and their eyes are on stalks because, obviously Moses died, over 1,000 years earlier, and Elijah didn't die, but went into heaven in a chariot made of fire. So obviously that doesn't make it sound less weird. And Peter kind of panics and starts making shelters for them. And one of the gospel writers says Peter did not know what he was saying. And if you read that well and slowly and with feeling, it would be hard for that not to be funny, because you can almost imagine John being embarrassed about Peter, and Jesus sort of, Moses looking at Jesus just like, who is this guy? And Jesus sort of saying, yeah, he's actually quite nice when you get to know him, but yeah, he's obviously just having one of those moments. And that's, to be fair, you did die quite a long time ago. So my other favorite comedy moment, and then we'll get off this, is in 1 Samuel with the witch of Endor.
Mm-hmm.
So Saul, God's king, God didn't want to give them a king, but they kind of really said, we want a king. And he said, don't have a king, he'll tax you at 10%. That seems like a lot to me. Times have changed a bit, haven't they? So let's not get into that. But Saul then does stuff that alienates God, and God says, I'm going to withdraw my blessing from you, and now David's going to be king after you die. Saul then ignores Samuel, and then there's about to be a battle, and so in order to speak to Samuel, he raises Samuel from the dead, like with a seance, via the witch of Endor, which is in itself a capital crime under the law. So and Samuel turns up, is raised from, it sort of comes up from the dead, and says to Saul, why are we having this conversation? I already told you that God's withdrawn his blessing. This is like, it's almost like a punchline to a running joke. And then Samuel says, oh, by the way, massive battle tomorrow. But anyway, I'm going back to the underworld now, where I'll see you and your sons tomorrow. And then just goes. And it's just basically like, what's Saul meant to make of that? He's just been told, see you in the land of the dead tomorrow. So the battle's not going to go well then. I mean, it's a train wreck. It's an absolute train wreck. It's really funny, weird, scary, interesting. But anyone reading that chapter out in church is almost certainly going to be encouraged to make it boring and not funny. That's quite an achievement. I think that's something that I really think Christians need to have a really serious think about.
So I guess, yeah, this is good, isn't it? Because I guess we've maybe said to some people who would think that Christianity is absurd, like, look again, but also to Christians, like, it's not all as serious as you think. Like,
yeah, and stop trying to flatten it out and make it normal, because the text will not allow you to do that. And embrace the weirdness and the absurdity, because that's kind of what's interesting.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question, which is sad because there are lots more, but I think we're just going to have this last one. If Christianity is so absurd, does that actually make it any more likely to be true?
That's a good question. I don't fully understand it. Does that make it more likely to be true? No, I don't think so, because there are plenty of things that are absurd that aren't true, I guess. It kind of at least makes it interesting and worthy of further investigation. And I think the thing that, as a society, we've got a real problem. There's now we've created a new verb, which is to other somebody. We have othered people. I'm not a language purist, but I hate it when we make verbs out of nouns. We need to action that. No, we have a verb for that. It's called act. You don't need actioning. It's called act, do, make. But anyway, but we kind of other people and just assume that they must be idiots to think what they think or to do what they do. We see this. The expression that is a bit of a red rag for me is, well, that tells you all you need to know about X, Y, or Z. No, it doesn't. Nothing tells you all you need to know about anything. And we need to stop saying that and doing that and get out of our echo chambers and actually listen carefully to what the other people are saying and try to understand it, because they're just somebody like you. who possibly has had different parents, different background, came to different conclusions. They're a good person who cares about the abstract nouns that you don't care about. They care about justice and you care about liberty. You care, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's, you know, so we need to listen and actually have a conversation about it, ideally in person. Obviously we can't do that at the moment. But the absurdity is what makes you kind of lean in, listen to them, but also realize how absurd you seem to them. And maybe there's like a humility there, which means you can actually have an honest conversation. And once you both admitted that you're both absurd, then you can ask any question and not worry about being laughed at, because we've already done all that. We've already established this whole thing's a bit of a joke. And then you can just ask the really difficult questions. And that's what I really hope people will do, because I think lots of people don't have questions to ask, and they don't want to ask them because they think they're going to sound stupid. Well, newsflash, we're all stupid and we all sound stupid, especially on social media. So maybe take the conversation offline and have an actual conversation with somebody.
Great. So embrace absurdity. Wonderful. Well, that has told us a little bit about what we need to know about James and about Christianity. Thank you so much, James, for chatting with us and answering all of those questions. It's been great.
Thank you very much. If you want to ask me more questions, then find me on Twitter, that James Cary, the website, jamescary.co.uk. But yeah, just ask or find me on Facebook or something. But if there are burning questions you want to ask me, then find me and ask me.
Fab. That is really kind. As James said, you can find him on his website. And he's also got, as he said, a new book that is coming out in June. So you might want to find out about that as well. And all sorts of other great stuff on there. So big thank you to James. A big thank you to all of you as well who've come along tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And for those of you who are listening later as well. If you'd like to find out more about Christianity, then why not chat to the friend who invited you along tonight? Or you can visit our church website. There's more information there about Sunday services. If you want to pop along to one of those, it's pretty easy at the moment because they're all online. Or you can even connect with someone in the church if you've got questions or want to explore things more fully there. As James said earlier in the evening, maybe one of the best things that you could do as a result of this evening is to read one of those accounts of Jesus's life that we find in the Bible. So just search one of those online, or again, ask the friend that invited you. I'm sure they'd be happy to point you in the direction of one of those. Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great evening.